Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for those of you who are joining and are yet to join. Uh, it is such a pleasure to have you as my guest, Myra. Myra Ezerins is a PhD candidate in management and a research assistant at the University of Arkansas. And we are going to discuss her foundational work in examining the experiences of neurodivergent individuals in the quest for employment and the challenges that they experience during interviews and even post, I guess, a successful, um, offer once they're in the organization. So, Myra, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, so happy to be here and have this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I understand you are receiving your doctorate in May of this year. So congratulations.
Yes, I am in the final steps of the process and really excited to get finished up.
Awesome. So I guess the question I suppose let's start off with is what is autism? What is neurodivergence? And a neurotypical, definition.
Sure. So, autism has been kind of understood from a medical lens historically, and that definition describes autism as having difficulties with social communication that impact your life or your ability to gain employment, in any way, just substantively impacts the way that you move through the world. And also includes different behaviors like repetitive movement, repetitive interests, things like that. Um, Now, neurodivergence kind of came out of a movement in the early 1990s that wanted to reframe this from sort of a medical condition into more of a social model. By saying that everyone kind of has this normal variation in their brains, and autism is just one of those types of variations. And so neurodiversity is the idea that, again, there are these different ways that people think, behave, interpret information, process information, and that variety in the way that people think and behave should be celebrated, and it's normal. And so within this kind of new social framing of autism, um, neurodivergence, or autism as being kind of a neurodivergent condition, is a condition that varies from the sort of like the dominant ways of thinking in society at the time. So neurotypical just means the way that most people in society behave, think, and interpret information. And so neurodivergence is any condition that varies from that kind of definition at this point in time in society.
Well, thanks for going through that. I mean, I think it's important for us to understand the distinctions so that we can have a proper discourse on how to address the challenges that individuals that in this particular instance we're going to be talking about autistic individuals
Mhm.
that they're experiencing, and how I suppose some accommodations can really benefit everyone, not just autistic individuals. And so I was really interested in the statistic that you had shared about rates of autism and how it has increased. Maybe you could shed a bit more light on that.
Sure. So I've been studying autism and employment since around 2021. And the rates for autism at that time, as released by the CDC, or Centers for Disease Control, were 1 in 88. So this is the rate of children being diagnosed in the US. Nowadays, so fast forward to 2024, 2025, the rate has increased to about 1 in 36 people. And this, I think, has been due to an increased discussion about the diagnostic criteria and how it's been kind of historically focused on the experiences of white men, and how that kind of has created barriers for getting people of color, women, and also the financially underprivileged access to diagnosis. And so, as we've started having these conversations and considering how these different people are experiencing their neurodivergence, what that looks like, what characteristics they're experiencing, we're getting better at capturing more and more people that are on the spectrum. And I think another thing to note is that when we say that the diagnostic rate is increasing, we're not necessarily saying that there are more and more people that are autistic. It's just that the tools that we have in place to better understand who is autistic are getting better. So the
Right.
diagnostic rate is getting closer to the actual rate that autism kind of exists in a normal population.
Right. That's really interesting. So that it's always been there. It just we just didn't have the proper lens to identify it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what I guess would be the common challenges and strengths that would be associated with individuals with autism.
So some of the challenges, of course, are again kind of part of the diagnostic criteria. So social communication. Autistic people tend to be direct, say what they mean. There's not a lot of sort of nuance or undercurrent or hidden
Sure.
meaning in what they say, and they expect communication to be that way from neurotypical. So this is where a lot of those communication
Right.
challenges happen. Is
Yeah.
different norms that they kind of have. I would say another few key characteristics that I would consider strengths are, special interests. A lot of autistic people have developed a really deep knowledge of certain subjects and have a really great passion for that. They also have the inability to hyperfixate or hyperfocus, which means that they can get really deep into a task and put their all into it. They tend to be very reliable, honest, dependable, punctual. A part of autism is kind of this profile of rigidity um, to forgetting the word schedules. So they like
Right.
to have routine and basically understand what's going to come down the line, and that helps them prepare.
Sure.
So that helps at work too, because they're rarely late. They'll always show up and do their work on time. So they're very dependable, very knowledgeable employees a lot of the time.
Yeah. And you touch on that when I was going through your article, you touch on these um, uh, that structure as being something that might help someone who is autistic to perform better during an interview because they know what to expect. And I love that we're gonna talk about that. Um, and leading to that, I mean, there are some really sad stats about unemployment rates as a result of um, bias and neurotypical processes that um, are not really conducive to a successful interview for individuals with autism.
Mhm.
I think you said something in the realm of about 70-80% of
Mhm.
individuals within the next you know um, decade. There's going to be about a million individuals that are going to be entering the workforce that will be unable to find gainful employment. And
Mhm.
I know we
Yes.
have similar challenges here in Canada. We've got uh, just in the last, well, in 2023, it was identified that 80% of individuals with autism or intellectual disabilities were unemployed. And
Mhm.
there have been some um, I guess steps. There's a high school students with intellectual disabilities integration project that the federal government has in place that offers like co-op placements, if you will, for
Mhm.
students between the ages of 16 and 21. They give them a minimum wage, and they give them an opportunity to kind of um, immerse themselves in a work environment and help them to get ready for gainful employment once they graduate. But truthfully, I don't know what the results of that program are. I don't know how successful it is and how the rest of corporate Canada, I suppose, embraces these individuals, and also maybe the processes and the training that goes along with that.
Mhm.
Um, and just yesterday, I saw a post from the Netherlands from Tristan Lavender and Evelyn Brouwers, who's a PhD, a doctor at Tilburg University, that 49% of young autistic adults go without pay, or without
Yes.
paid work. So
Yeah.
it's a global phenomenon. It's
Yeah.
not. I tend to have sometimes a bit of a North American view, and then it really kind of put things into contrast, and really perspective, I guess, about how universal this challenge is.
Yeah. And I would even say that, we call the unemployment of autistic people kind of this unemployment crisis, because it is so stark, and because the unemployment rates are so much higher than people with other disabilities, even similar ones like learning disabilities. An unemployment rate for autism is higher. And I would even say that it's worse than even those stark numbers because of underemployment. So I mentioned earlier that autistic people have very strong interests, and that leads them to often be sort of overqualified for the roles that they're currently in.
Yeah.
A lot of them do pursue higher education. They'll have
Right.
degrees. They'll have this deep breadth of knowledge on different topics, and yet a lot of them end up kind of being shuffled into retail jobs, or entry level positions. And so it's not just the unemployment crisis, it's also this underemployment crisis.
Right.
In addition to that, although a lot of these supported employment programs do offer employment and are great, to give people experience and exposure to work life, there is also something in the United States called Section 14C that allows employers to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. So there's also this idea that neurodivergent labor is kind of undervalued. And so if they are employed, they may still be not being compensated fairly for their labor, and they may not be in a role that fully allows them to be themselves and to show
Yeah.
off kind of the skill set that they've developed over their lifetime.
Yeah. Wow. Um, I could totally see that. And I wonder if I can. There was a question that popped up from Ryan Moore here, and I'm just going to display it here. But he asked, can you talk about the lack of double empathy, about how the lack of double empathy gap excludes autistics from things like employment, and what are the incentives for neurotypicals to embrace double empathy, considering how it's only us who have to be empathetic. Um,
Yeah. So the double empathy problem was proposed by Damian Milton. I think the first paper was back in 2011 or 2012. But he proposed, this conversation kind of came about from the medical model of autism, which proposed that autistic people lack a theory of mind, or basically they were unable to feel empathetic, unable to put themselves into the shoes of others, and therefore understand kind of the effects that their behavior have on other people's emotions, information processing, etc. But what Milton said is basically, if this is the case, then why are communication problems bidirectional? So if neurotypicals have this capacity for empathy, or they have this theory of mind and they're able to put themselves in other people's shoes, then why are they unable to do that for autistic people? So we still see that neurotypicals misunderstand or misinterpret the behavior of autistic people. And so the issue is not necessarily a lack of empathy. It's kind of this inability of both neurotypicals and autistic people to understand sort of the cultural norms of the other neurotype. And that's what's creating all these problems in communication. And so what that means for the workplace is that rather than trying to teach autistic people all the time to have empathy for neurotypicals or to learn how to behave neurotypical or learn how to interpret neurotypical communication and behavior, that instead this should be kind of a joint process where we're also asking neurotypicals to better understand autistic communication and autistic behavior. That way, if someone who is autistic is not engaging in eye contact, for example, the neurotypical person isn't saying, oh, well, they're being rude, they're disengaged. Rather, they understand that that's just a behavior that perhaps is allowing the autistic person to even focus better and listen better. So the double empathy problem gives us a lens for kind of understanding how miscommunication problems are not the fault of an autistic person. It's kind of situated in both parties, and it's something that needs to be addressed.
Right. And
Um,
I guess we're kind of diving into that, aren't we?
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as the second part of the question, what are the incentives for neurotypicals to do this? I think um, I I think this is an issue that I try to address in my research, and that is coming at this from kind of an organizational perspective. Because I do think that individuals in companies are not going to do things unless the organization creates kind of the culture or environment or even pressures to engage in it. So I think if the organization has a culture that encourages peer-to-peer communication, training that includes both peers, autistic talent, as well as managers and things like that, then we can create a more friendly and kind of incentive oriented environment for that type of behavior.
Yeah. I think that segues into and kind of preempts my next question, which was going to be, what causes autistic people to experience higher levels of stress in job interviews, and this you identify it as masking as a neurotypical, and trying to sort of emulate what a neurotypical would expect from an interviewee, I guess
Mhm.
is one of those things. But I'm sure that's just one of the aspects that leads them to experience these high levels of stress, as you mentioned. But can we talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So the research shows that people that are autistic face higher rates of discrimination and stigma than, neurotypicals do. So because of this kind of history of contacting negative reactions or stigma or discrimination, oftentimes they'll try to hide their autistic traits and appear neurotypical to get through this interview process. But of course, there's the fear that what they're doing is not an actually successful mask. So in my research, I found that autistic people have higher rates of job interview anxiety, and that can include things like performance anxiety, behavioral anxiety, appearance anxiety. So all of these things that they're managing, kind of their impressions or other people's impressions of them in the interview, they're feeling higher rates of anxiety because if they do it incorrectly, then they will kind of touch those negative sanctions or be discriminated against in some way. And so, on kind of a follow up research question, when we asked people to really explain what is driving these higher rates of job interview anxiety, we found a large difference between allistic or not autistic people and autistic people. And autistic applicants mentioned that they had a lot of fears about how they're being perceived. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so again, it's coming into this. Well, am I doing this correctly? Am I doing what that interviewer wants of me? And if I get this wrong, there are going to be a lot more negative reactions, potentially, impacting my ability to gain employment. Real impactful outcomes that create this kind of fear of doing things wrong.
Yeah, and you make a distinction as well, how neurotypical participants in your study um, kind of liked that more sort of face to face engagement and uh, being able to sort of engage with someone at the other end, and the experience was quite different for autistic individuals because of these levels of stress
Mm-hmm.
and the self-identification. When you're a lot of these applications will have do you identify as an individual with disability, can be a bit of a double-edged sword. There was an interesting point that you mentioned in your article where individuals that do identify disability, there is evidence that there is an increased success rate, I guess, in leading to employment or successful interviews. Yet on the other side, um, there was also a very stark evidence that uh, individuals would actually be excluded because of their honesty and indicating that I think something like what was it 26% fewer expressions of interest from employers
Mm-hmm.
um, as a result of that.
Yeah.
So you're kind of damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and so it feels like you're sort of uh, the path forward really is it's a bit of a gauntlet, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, I guess and then you layer on top of that there you discuss also the distinction between the experiences of autistic men and autistic women, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, and I'd love for you to kind of dive into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in our research project, we looked at kind of allistic or non-autistic people compared to autistic people, and then we also kind of subsectioned that to look at the experiences of men versus women and how those differed. And we found that autistic women in particular faced higher rates of job interview anxiety than their autistic male peers, as well as allistic women and autistic men or allistic men. And a lot of this is driven by their experiences as being autistic as well as being a woman. So being a woman is also kind of the minority gender, and then the autism on top of that, and not necessarily always fitting into autism stereotypes, leads to kind of, again, this double-edged sword or this additive experience. So they're facing anxiety about how they're being perceived as an autistic person. They're also facing anxiety about how they're being perceived as a woman,
Yeah.
and this creates a lot higher rates of anxiety. And again, this is driven by how they're being perceived. I do think that there are stronger pressures for women to adhere to gender norms than there are for men, or there are stricter rules, and so violation of those rules sometimes can lead to negative sanctions just as much as violating neurotypical norms can be. So they did have more fears about being perceived, and this particularly showed up in the types of accommodations that they were requesting. We found that autistic women in particular wanted to remove the social element from interviews. So they would rather have text-based or asynchronous interviews, um,
Right.
and kind of remove that social element. They also wanted their interview performance to be rated by algorithms or machines more often than autistic or allistic people, autistic men or allistic people. And again, this is removing that kind of social judgment that I think women in particular feel, but also autistic women feel most strongly because of their kind of two intersectional identities. When I compared this to autistic men, on the other hand, a lot of autistic men brought up that despite this kind of social communication challenge, sometimes seeing someone face to face was easier to interpret kind of ambiguous social cues than it was to like be on the phone or engaging in writing. So there were some autistic men that preferred face to face communication, whereas it was a lot more autistic women who kind of wanted to remove that social element.
Yeah. And I mean, Natalie actually brings up an interesting point here, and and really, I feel like it's timely with what you're expressing here. But can you discuss our autistic burnout and what employers can do to help support individuals who feel they are inching towards it? And you had mentioned in the article about the masking. It might help them to get the role, but then having to keep that mask on and
Hmm.
pass as neurotypical can lead to low self-esteem and burnout. And so maybe we can talk about that. And also how does that I guess differ from neurotypical burnout? Was a follow-up from Natalie, but why don't we address this one first?
Yeah, so I do think masking is a huge cause of autistic burnout, because not only are you managing workloads, uh, job demands, things like that, but you're also consciously trying to monitor the environment for threats, change your behavior to mitigate any threats, constantly evaluating your own behavior to see if it is successful or is that putting you at risk, constantly managing other people's emotions kind of and reactions to you, in addition to managing your own reactions and emotions kind of in the moment. So, this is a
Yeah,
huge cognitive load that autistic people are carrying above and beyond all of the demands that everyone kind of has on the job. And one thing that I've talked with a few people about, I get questions all the time. Well, how is this different than people just acting professional at work? Or how is this different from impression management, which is something that a lot of people do kind of in the professional work
mm-hmm.
environment? But the difference here is that it goes above and beyond behaving in a professional way. It's fundamentally changing and hiding who you are, um, and monitoring for real direct threats. So there are really startling statistics that autistic people face a lot higher rates of bullying, incivility. This leads to higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicide ideation. And so the difference between a neurotypical and an autistic person is, if a neurotypical messes up at work, someone might call them, an a-hole, or brush them off as rude. But an autistic person might face actual, aggression or violence in the workplace. And so there's, again,
Wow.
a huge cognitive load that they undertake in kind of managing how they're being perceived. As far as artistic burnout, this is such a hard problem to solve, and it's something that researchers are kind of trying to work to understand, kind of right now in the moment. So I don't have
Yeah,
solutions for how to solve this, but I think a big part of it is understanding when it's happening and taking a break. I think that's really important. A lot of people don't feel like they are able to take breaks and
yeah,
recover. But once you're in autistic burnout, you kind of can't get out of it until you take that break and you recover. Otherwise, it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse.
yeah,
So I would say focus on recovery activities, um, you know, rest. I think all of those are the best kind of things you can do, unfortunately.
yeah. And that's interesting how you had mentioned that it's kind of hard to turn off that performance. The working, the keep going, and I imagine then on the other side, where you have individuals that maybe overcorrect, to a point that Alexia has made here about championing neurodivergent colleagues, hyping them up, overselling their strengths. I mean, how stressful is that?
Yeah, so I'm actually working on a project right now where we're thinking about, how can neurodiversity hiring initiatives actually take their programs to the next level, right? And so this is something that we're currently thinking about, how uh, although it can do a lot of good to have, neurodiversity centers or programs that help neurodivergent talent get into organizations. Once they're there, they face all these additional demands to, exactly this: be the token person in the organization, be a superhero, be the autistic superpower.
Yeah,
And so they're having to manage, again, all of their job demands, managing their impression and their peers, and yes, addressing some of these additional kind of work demands as well. So, although really well intentioned, sometimes
yeah.
create more work for an autistic person at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and it's such a very human experience. You know, we're all kind of bungling along, even, you know, those of us that have the best of intentions, you know, possibly making things just as challenging or maybe even more challenging with the load of like expectation on these individual shoulders. But I want to go back just a little bit, because you know the focus of your article was on the interview experience. So, you know, what were, you know, after you completed your study and you had, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had 100 holistic participants and 100 autistic participants, of a pool of 400, 200 holistic, 200 autistic, and you know, what did you find? What were the most desired job interview accommodations for autistic individuals as a result of this, and how did that differ from neurotypicals?
Sure. Just quick correction, we had 200 total participants, so 100 holistic, 100 autistic. And what we actually found is that there's not a whole lot of differences between the two on the types of things that they would like to see in a job interview, which
Right.
really speaks to the idea that these are accommodations that could be implemented kind of for everyone in the organization as a common practice. And this is one thing that we talk about a lot in the article, because if organizations are able to offer kind of an array of possible accommodations or changes to the job interview based on individual preference, then it removes the need for any autistic person or anyone that needs an accommodation to disclose any type of disability and ask for it. So we're hoping that these are things that could be kind of offered upfront to people,
Yeah.
and they include really low cost, easy to implement processes and procedures. So, for example, both autistic people and allistic people wanted more flexibility on the times that they could choose to perform an interview. They wanted help getting to and from the job interview itself. So figuring out, you know, where do I park? Can I get a map of the location? Can I have someone meet me at the door and guide me in? So things like this. Privacy, having not too many interviewers at one time, because that can be overwhelming.
Mm.
Getting job interview questions ahead of time so that they can really think and prepare for the job interview. And one of the things that my paper talks about is that in the management literature, there's this emphasis on standardized interviews because they are more highly predictive of future job performance. So they're a tool that organizations can use to say, hey, this person performed really well in this job interview. This is indicative that they'll also perform well on the job. But what's happening for autistic people is that they're kind of being falsely filtered out because the job interview is not necessarily predictive or indicative of their future job performance, because it's more reliant on these kind of ambiguous social cues. And
Mm.
so by doing something as simple as providing job interview questions ahead of time, an autistic person can sit there and think, okay, what are my skills? What is my relevant job experience? What past situations have I been in that I can really use to describe my experience in this moment to speak to this? Which is the information that a job interviewer needs to see whether that person would be good on the job to begin with. And so, what we're kind of proposing is that by offering some flexibility to address the needs or accommodation needs of different people, we might actually be able to improve the predictive validity of job interviews by kind of removing this false negative kind of process that's happening.
Right. And I wonder then, I mean, and you mentioned that these are relatively simple solutions that can be implemented that are very low cost, and have a benefit across the board. And when we had a discussion before, you made a really great point about, you know, what would you prefer? Somebody who can off the cuff give you a response that may be something you want to hear, or somebody that prepares, does some research, and approaches your interview question as if they would a task that they have to do in their day-to-day operations.
Exactly.
And it was such a great point. Like, how do you refute that? That's exactly who you want. You want somebody who's thoughtful and mindful about the work that they're producing.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me think as well about, my efforts in recruiting individuals, of, what a great idea, presenting questions ahead of time, like, hey, these are the questions I'm going to ask you. um, I'd like to go through that, and it takes away also those, because I know that I am guilty of these social cues and sort of nonverbal communication, I guess, traits that I catch myself kind of identifying, and I like to look at people in the eye. I like to smile. I like to engage, and not everybody operates that way. And so for me, it's a nice wake up call. And so I know that these are things that I can take away from quite easily. And yeah, it's not going to cost me anything to do. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in fact, it'll help me, because I'll be able to get, a response that I need, rather than kind of pulling teeth, extracting information in a
Mm-hmm.
painful process. It's something that can, kind of upfront, can be provided to me, and something that I could also talk to clients about as well. Ways of kind of helping improve their process.
And this is another thing that we highlight in our paper. We have a checklist of all of the accommodations that were identified, as well as options for those accommodations at different levels of maybe cost or investment at the organizational level. And for each of those accommodations, we provide some examples of benefits both to the individual as well as to the organization. So, people might feel less anxiety and feel better able to perform and more prepared, but organizations are also going to reap some benefits by getting better applicants, widening their talent pool, increasing the reputation of their organization as kind of a safe place. And so these are things that, yes, benefit the autistic person, but also benefit non-autistic people, just the general, applicant pool, and they also benefit the organization. So we're talking about a lot of benefits for not a lot of cost or investment at all.
Right. And it really kind of does. I feel like it this is really tied to culture. What is the kind of culture that you want to build for your organization? And it really is a top down uh, initiative. And so if that is clear, then I feel like those are the organizations where this will be kind of low hanging fruit. These are kind of accommodations and changes that can be easily and quickly made. And there'll be some other organizations where it'll be more of a challenge, because there's more convincing that needs to be done, and maybe obliterating of biases and stigmas that are associated with the autistic and neurodivergent discussion in general. Um, there was a really interesting question that Natalie posed here, and she wondered, it's kind of going back to that the gender
Mhm.
dynamics. And so, have you noticed whether autistic women who are honest are perceived as being rude or bossy, whereas men aren't discriminated in the same way? I suppose that would equally apply to holistic women as well, unfortunately. So,
Yes. So I have found this to be the case. I conducted a qualitative study last summer where I interviewed 10 employed autistic women and kind of asked them to describe their experiences managing their autistic identity as well as their gender identity. And I asked them about, social interactions, both positive and negative, and to just kind of describe what happens to them at work. And a key theme that kept coming up was that autistic women were honest and provided a lot of beneficial but critical feedback. And it was often across hierarchical levels in the organization. So they would provide this feedback to their boss. And this goes back again to kind of these autistic characteristics, which is that a lot of autistic people don't necessarily buy into or pay attention to the levels of social hierarchy as much as neurotypicals do. So an autistic person would not find it, rude or overreaching to provide honest feedback to someone that is technically their, supervisor or superior in an organization. And so a lot of times these women were getting kind of these negative sanctions for doing that, because
Mm.
they were perceived as overstepping, as being rude or too direct, again, or being bossy because they're, telling their own boss things that can be improved upon in the organization.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't do a comparative study at that point to see whether this kind of holds up also for an autistic male group. But I do think a lot of that is driven by their gender rather than the autism piece, which is their honesty. Because I do think that men are kind of expected to be more direct and assertive, just based on kind of generalizable social norms. So we definitely are finding that in our research, and I'm currently doing my dissertation, kind of following up on a lot of these pieces that I found in that research study.
Wow. Well, yeah, and so still lots of work to do, and I love how you make a real point of saying that this is very foundational work. You're just barely scratching the surface. You talk also about technology as something that could be used to I guess even the playing field and for just across the board. So maybe you could talk to that.
Yeah. So the technology piece actually came from an interaction I had at a conference, and I don't want to call out the company, but there was a company offering asynchronous interview technology that had kind of gamified the process for autistic and neurodivergent candidates. So this meant that instead of doing a job interview, they would be working on math problems or doing small games that kind of provided some evidence of their skill that would be, applicable for the job. And I remember seeing this and kind of thinking, well, that, this is kind of based on autism stereotypes. We mentioned before that not every autistic person is a savant or has a superpower. There are a lot of wide ranges of experience, and abilities here. So I kind of looked at that project and I was like, I think this is based on maybe a neurotypical's perspective on what an autistic person would want or need. And so one of the things that I wanted to address in this research project was looking at, yes, technology. We know that technology is inexpensive a lot of times for organizations to implement. It can create kind of an easier process for both parties. And we know from prior research as well that autistic people do tend to feel comfortable engaging with technology. So I wanted to see, well, what do autistic people have to say about how technology could be implemented? In what ways would they want to see it implemented? And then what are kind of the benefits that they see as having this technology put into place in the job interview? And we did find some differences. A lot of people said that virtual interviews are kind of beneficial for everyone. They save a lot of costs. They save time. They're efficient. They do remove some social cues. Like, for example, I could be fidgeting, below the table, and you wouldn't know. And
Right.
so that's a behavior that then wouldn't be impacting your perception of me.
Yeah.
I'm also in my own home. So, for example, I can control the lighting here. I can control the temperature, the sound. So it gives me a sense of control over my own environment. So that's something that's pretty easy to implement that, would be a comfortable accommodation for autistic people. But also, a lot of people said, text messaging as a resource would be great. It would be awesome to be able to show my portfolio kind of virtually online. Another thing that people mentioned was virtual job previews. So seeing the work environment, meeting some peers, kind of getting a realistic job preview of what it would be like to work in an organization.
Yeah.
There's just a lot more information sharing that technology could provide that would be useful for them, both in making their decision as well as helping them perform better in job interviews.
Yeah. I actually really loved um, how you came to this. There's a line, the adage, "Nothing about us without us,"
Yeah.
and I found that your article really embraced that and demonstrates that. Um, and I also love how it kind of promotes this universal design and standardization of practice
Hmm.
that can be applied across holistic and autistic spectrum.
Hmm.
And I think it kind of takes away a lot of the pushback and the objections about accommodations, like it's unfair and it's inequitable, and we're creating new inequalities. Well, no, it kind of makes that a moot point, which I think was really interesting. How holistic individuals and autistic individuals in your study expressed a lot of similar stresses
Hmm.
and desires for how things could really be improved
Right.
process wise.
Right.
Um,
I
and
think that
so,
kind of
yeah,
it's like what we would consider a confounding variable in the job interview, right? So it may be affecting someone's performance and it may not affect their actual job performance. And so by removing some of that stress, you're going to get a better picture of how someone actually behaves. So anytime we can, increase the predictive accuracy of a job interview, it's kind of a win for everyone.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess what do you I guess notwithstanding the reduction in stress across the board, but um, what are some benefits, I guess, to the organizations that do implement these changes?
Um, Well, one thing that we're seeing a lot of times with all of these neurodivergent hiring programs that have kind of come into place, they talk a lot about how this is kind of an unpreviously tapped labor pool. So a lot of organizations supposedly are facing labor shortages, especially in very highly technical and skill oriented roles. And I do want to kind of caveat this by saying that not every autistic person wants to go into IT or data science or is skilled at that.
Sure.
But companies like Microsoft, EY, Dandelion, there's all these programs, SAP, they're identifying this as a talent pool that is very good at pattern recognition, attention to detail. Again, they're very highly skilled in their area of expertise, and so they get this talent. And they get all of the other autism traits along with it. So the dependability, the punctuality, autistic people are less likely to engage in office politics and things like that. So they're good employees. They're good at what they do,
Right.
and organizations are realizing this is a really good talent pool for us to start hiring. Um, so they get all of those benefits, and what I think another benefit as well is this kind of social responsibility signaling. So organizations that have neurodiversity hiring programs also kind of benefit reputationally by being an
Right.
inclusive place to work. So they're
Yeah.
also going to attract a wider pool of talent that are also attracted to those values and ideals as well.
Yeah. So there's a, I guess there's that selfish component that ends up being a of a benefit to the organization as well. So
Mhm.
hopefully that's something that helps push them over the edge. You mentioned about limiting false positives. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the idea of a false positive would be someone who gets hired based on maybe a job interview where their job interview was not necessarily accurately indicative of future job performance. So they
Right.
were falsely chosen where they might not have been otherwise. And a lot of what we argue in our paper is that that happens because a lot of times job interviews are over reliant on social cues rather than actual job related or job relevant skills. And I do want to also provide a caveat that by saying that, for some roles, social skills are relevant. So for like a sales position, you do need to have some level of social skill, etc.
Yeah.
But the research does show that, social skills account for the majority of kind of the variance in whether someone is chosen for a position. So this idea of false negative is that someone who is extremely talented at impression management or extremely talented at that social impression piece could get hired for a role despite not necessarily having the relevant job qualifications. And by reducing the amount that social skills contribute towards job interview scores, then we can kind of remove those false negatives and help organizations hire based on job relevant information instead.
Right. Well, I guess I mean that is. I'm in recruitment. I'm just thinking about the reason why an individual like myself and others uh, are called upon to assist is you know the screening process, the sort of going through I guess sort of a fine with the fine tooth comb a candidate's a background, their experiences, and really kind of I guess putting in the effort to sort of reduce those false positives
Mm-hmm.
and really shine a light on individuals that perhaps would not otherwise have the same um, success if they were to go through an automated application system or process. And so I can really see the benefit across the board for that. So I mean, it's really it's hard to identify a reason to not implement. So I guess it really boils down to, I guess, the bias and perception that really needs to be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess to that point, Natalie actually had a really interesting question here about sick time. You mentioned about rest. Autistic individuals and helping them to sort of manage um, their I guess their uh, I guess preventing them from getting to that burnout stage. So recognizing that they might need this rest, how does this impact job performance and the health of employees?
Yes. So this is going to vary individual to individual and company to company based on, organizational policies for sick time, a person's job performance capabilities themselves. Um, I will say in a lot of informal, so this is not based on, research that I've conducted, but kind of my interactions with the community. I have seen that because of some of the characteristics of autism, like hyper focus, for example, attention to detail, and autistic people tend to give their job their 100% effort, um, rather than what we see in neurotypicals is typically they're giving about like 75%, and that's normal and acceptable. So what I've heard and seen in these kind of informal conversations is that autistic people tend to get their work done quicker in shorter amounts of time than neurotypical peers. And so one recommendation I might have for people that are engaging in remote work is, take take the full amount of time, reduce your levels of effort from 100% down to 75%, take your time, slow it down. Or if you are unable to do that, take the extra time that you would have spent working and take that time to rest, which I recognize is kind of only a benefit to salaried employees and not hourly employees. I would also say that people should take FMLA if they need that to recover. That is a federally instituted law that helps people take the time they need for personal health and things like that. I know several people that have taken FMLA for autistic burnout. There is, of course, a risk.
For us Canadians, can you
Oh, sure. Yes.
explain that?
So
Yeah.
it is the Family Medical Leave Act that allows you to take up to 3 months off of work to care for yourself or an immediate family member. And there are some stipulations, like you need
Sure.
to work in an organization that has so many employees, and you have to have worked there for a certain period of time. I believe it's over a year. But there are some of these programs in place that you can use to take time off, and you are federally protected from retaliation, and your job is typically protected in that case. So it's very much dependent on your organization's kind of culture, values,
Yeah.
policies, your own the way that you work, the level of burnout, et cetera, and as well as, I guess, some of these national policies as well.
Yeah, and I want to be mindful of the time. This has been a really insightful and really amazing discussion. We've got about 5 minutes left, and in the conclusion of your article, you make it very clear that this is foundational work. That again, we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more to be explored. What's next in your research? Where do you see the next phase of your research? What do you want to explore?
Yeah. Actually, my first ever research article on this topic did a multidisciplinary review of kind of all of the research that's been done on autism and employment. And in that paper, we set out a pretty rigorous research agenda. So my project on autism and interviews is just one piece kind of that's been taken out of that paper where we recommend looking into this. But a lot of the research that's been done so far has focused on either the pre-employment stage or the job interview process. So how can we prepare autistic individuals to do the job search, to have the skills, et cetera, and then how do we get them into the organization, since the job interview is such a large barrier.
Yeah,
But there hasn't been a lot done on how do we then sustain employment for people that get into the organization. So a lot of times the support for neurodivergent talent ends after the job interview, after that pipeline process is complete.
yeah,
But we know that autistic people vary in terms of what motivates them. They vary in terms of what demands they're facing at work, what needs they have. We also know that employment has, health and well-being outcomes, and the health and well-being of individuals helps them stay in work. So, for example, if we talk about autistic burnout, if we don't address that problem, then we're not going to see the employment rates for autistic people improve, because they'll gain employment but then leave employment due to such high rates of burnout. So
yeah.
these are the problems that I'm now trying to address in my research by looking at, what can we do now once people are on the job to support them, make them feel included, with a specific focus on what organizations can do. Because just to call back to that double empathy problem, we know that, autistic people, these are not problems that they're able to solve. These are systemic problems, these are cultural problems, problems with organizational policies and work tasks and things like that. So what can organizations do? And again, I'm thinking about easy to implement, cost effective solutions to help maintain an environment where autistic people and neurodivergent people can thrive.
Right. And I suppose that if anybody wants to get a hold of you, then to have this discussion, you have a newly created consulting firm, Vertevia. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Yes. I would be happy to, help anyone think through this if they're trying to implement kind of a neurodivergent process, or have questions about their own organization's processes or anything like that. I'm also, you can easily reach me at my email, and I would be happy to have a discussion about anything that we've talked about today.
Right. Awesome. And I'll put this email up here as well, and I'll make sure to put links to the your article as well, so anyone can sort of have a read. It's a fantastic read, and it's been such an enlightening conversation. I hope this is the first of many that we'll have, and I can't wait to see what you come up with next. So, Myra, thank you so much for being a guest, for being so generous with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. I think we had some really great, insightful questions and comments from the
Yeah, absolutely. The audience participation was fantastic. So thanks all of you for joining us, and please make sure to connect with Myra and check out Vertevia. so you can great get some great guidance on how to implement some change, some real change that'll not only benefit neurodivergent uh, stakeholders, but everyone across
Yep.
the full spectrum. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.